Whosoever will be saved, before all things it is necessary that he hold the Catholic faith.
Welcome to Veritas Thus, or Truth and Incense, a podcast where we discuss the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the faith, and the liturgy, which is the public expression of that faith, especially from the Anglican perspective of the Anglican heritage. We are hosts. I'm Father Gregory Seeley, priest in charge at St. Thomas of Canterbury in Roanoke, Virginia,
And I'm Father Deacon Lance Davis. I'm curate at All Saints Church in Aiken, South Carolina.
On this, our, third podcast now, I wanted to look at what is possibly the stickiest point or bête noire or more difficult aspect for some Anglicans today, especially Anglo-Catholics, and that is the Protestant elements or question, is Anglicanism Protestant? And if so, how? And I want to go through three different areas, but I wanted to go look at basically her structure, how she's organized as a church, her liturgy, and then her doctrine. And I want to begin by laying out that I think that the via media is generally the term that's most commonly used when speaking about Anglicanism, halfway between, say, Protestantism and Catholicism. That's a little bit of a vague term and was used at a period where they were trying to articulate their position in the midst of what was then a raging sea of controversy in the mid to late 1500s. But I'm going to posit that Anglicanism is politically Protestant, but not doctrinally Protestant, or certainly not dogmatically Protestant. So when we mentioning Protestantism, what are your thoughts initially on the Protestant nature of the Church of England?
Well, I think we first have to recognize that this term Protestant has clearly evolved in the last 500 years. It is interesting that the church in England fairly early on seemed comfortable with the term, while at the same time asserting her Catholic heritage and her continuity with the patristic church. I think arguably the Church of England used that term before it was ever really applied to the continental Reformed churches, which, as I understand, even to this day, say the Lutherans are referred to as the evangelicals, the evangelical church in Germany. So I think what we have to say is Protestant seems to be used in the 16th century in relation to the church's governance polity vis-a-vis the Church of Rome. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what role does the papacy play in the jurisdiction of the church and her bishops? But I would argue that Protestant is a moniker that largely substitutes for the issues around the investiture controversy. That I would argue, in some sense, I think what we see with Henry and then later on through Elizabeth is a renewal of that controversy. England, it seems, never really was terribly happy with the conclusion that the Pope should have the headship and appoint the bishops and things like that. And so what we see, I would argue, is Protestant means that we are no longer under a jurisdictional authority of Rome. And then given that time period, the head of the church, in some sense, reverts to the monarch. Of course, there's plenty of history of that in Christianity. To say that Protestant means non-Catholic, I think is anachronistic for the time period. And also it presumes today the definitions of the papacy from Vatican I, which I think were much less clearly understood even by Rome, certainly prior to Trent. So this idea...
I think that's key, is that I something you mentioned that I thought about is that I have to wonder, and I don't actually know this for any kind of fact, that the term Protestant was something that Rome slapped on any church who was going against or rebelling or disagreeing or what having you with this during this whole period there. But England seems to have adopted it very quickly and became a Protestant church very quickly. And so I think you're right that they fit into so I remember reading this. It's a fascinating piece of history that actually England's frustration with Rome predates the Reformation by quite a bit. In fact, the 100 Years' War, wherein Joan of Arc is involved and everything, and even before that, with the Avignon captivity, is that much of the papacy was French. And so when the popes were issuing these things and coming out with these proclamations and such, this isn't Rome speaking, independently and apolitically. This is France, who they're currently at war with. And so there was a distrust, I think, of the papacy and of its ability to arbitrate, neutrally fairly early on.
That's right. And I mean, if you go back to Magna Carta, right there in the opening of the document, we see that the Church of England is declared to be free in perpetuity. Well, free of what? Free of foreign influence, free of foreign control, which of course is the exact same argument that's being made for the rights of the English monarchs themselves, the English nation as a whole. So I think part of the problem is you have the papacy really develops an awful lot of political power between the 11th and the 16th centuries, very rapidly. And we have to understand today that the papacy, I think, exercised itself more as a monarchical or imperial power, really, frankly, than it did as an ecclesial one for many hundreds of years. And so to assert the independence of the Church of England from the papacy is primarily, I think, first and foremost, a political assertion that a foreign monarch will not have jurisdiction over this realm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really where, because people talk about the Church of England being established by King Henry when he broke, and really that's simply not true. King Henry, his break was really for dynastic reasons, not for necessarily religious reasons. And I don't even personally think he really intended to leave the breach for good. It was a political game he was playing. He dies and they're separated still. Obviously they come back under Mary, and then but then Elizabeth really is where Anglicanism is founded, and Elizabeth decides with her bishops and her divines to remain separate and to build this unique thing. And she doesn't take the title of head of the Church of England. It's the protector, if I'm not mistaken, isn't it?
She refers to herself essentially as the supreme governor of the Church of England, not head. And so there's a sense there of.
Well, what I like about that is I think the idea of a Christian prince having both the obligation to establish the true religion in their domain, and then a certain authority to assist in the choosing of bishops and actively governing. Constantine was like that. You had back in Nicaea and all the various emperors were involved in the councils, and this is a long history of this, of the Christian prince being more involved in the governing of the church and making sure the church had a voice and that the faith was established and propagated.
Well, and up until just a few hundred years ago, technically, the Holy Roman Emperor had veto power over papal elections. So clearly there's a long tradition of the princes having some kind of say. Now we can argue how good that might be, and certainly that's predicated on the idea that your prince is in fact a Christian. Today's democratic and largely secular governments would pose a problem there, as we well know. But I think this idea again of Protestantism has to be balanced by the fact that, well, why is it that William Laud was offered the cardinal's hat? Okay, so we're talking a period at this point past Elizabeth I mean, it is clear that the English Church has asserted her independence, and yet, yes, we know it was largely political reasons on behalf of the papacy trying to bring the English bishops back into communion. But still, you're reaching out to a man who is consecrated in the English Church post-Reformation and offering him to be made a cardinal. Now, I don't think they would have done that, and to my knowledge, that never happened with, say, the Lutheran or the Calvinist sects. I'm not aware of any of them being offered that. So what does that make of the Roman Church's view of the English Church, even as late as the 17th century?
Almost mid, yeah, exactly. So I think maybe that's the key thing is, as you say, there's the idea that the ability of the English Church to govern her immediate affairs and to correspond to the needs, the culture and the needs of the people as she sees fit. Because again, Rome was very heavy-handed. You need to conform to Rome. We talked earlier about the idea that, you have, even at some point, the Roman canon was imposed upon these churches who had their own liturgies. You had to be just like Rome. And this is something, it becomes even more so as the centuries roll along, as you said, Vatican I and such. But I think that there was a thing with England was the assertion that the English Church should be able to govern its own affairs itself and correspond to the needs of the culture as the monarch and the bishop saw fit.
Yes, and there's I call it a bit of an ecclesial legend because I have been unable to track down a primary source for this, but there is a long-standing idea, and I've been able to trace it back really to the 17th century. That's the earliest I can get, that Pope Pius V, prior to Elizabeth's formal excommunication, had extended to her the possibility of retaining the Book of Common Prayer and essentially the liturgical reforms in England if she would restore the church to communion with Rome.
I'll reference that when we get to our brief discussion of the 39 articles, is that the Sacramentalist podcast, as well as the North American Anglican, have done extensive work on this. But the Sacramentalist podcast had Bishop Chandler Jones on several months ago, and they did a relatively exhaustive look at Anglican orders, which I think we can link to in the show notes. And I recommend anybody go back at him. But he made that comment, and I responded to Father Walker and said, "Oh my gosh, can I get that reference that the bishop made?" And he was going to look into it. I haven't heard, but the bishop, Bishop Jones, Chandler Jones, referenced that the Pope reached out to Queen Elizabeth and offered to bring the Church of England back as it was, with the Book of Common Prayer in place under Rome at that time. She did not accept, and honestly, if you know anything about that period, the Protestant sentiment was far too rife for them to be able to have done that. There were too many people in England who were not going to accept papal authority as it was for her to be able to do that. Again, you wish there was some way they could have been in union with or what have you. I don't know if this was the idea of, there is, and I forgot to look this up. I think it's like Dominus Jesus or something. It's like early 1200s, and the Pope comes out and states, "It is necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff."
Yeah. Unum Sanctam is the name of the document.
Thank you. And that, which wasn't really accepted well in its own day, it was considered an overreach of power. But that kind of attitude you could see, and again, England would never, she couldn't have brought England back in with Rome with that kind of an attitude.
Well, that's right. And Rome, of course, only further proves Elizabeth's point by then essentially Pius V issuing an assassination order. And I mean, these are the kinds of things that when we engage in discussions with our Roman brethren, I want to say, you need to understand that the papacy's problem, first and foremost, for most of its history, has been a political problem. Mm-hmm. And I would suggest that the only reason we wound up with the Vatican I definitions that really then started I think, opening the door to questioning the Church of England again with their orders and such was because Rome was faced with the prospect of losing her political power, which, of course, in some sense, she did.
I want to do a podcast on orders at some point, not immediately, but soonish, and go into that. And I think it can be shown really very easily that that decision, Apostolicae Curiae, and the declaration of Anglican orders is null and void, was very much a political decision. It really is not based on the encyclical itself is kind of a train wreck of theology. And if you look at the situation there, like, why would he do this kind of ham-fisted thing? It was a political move. So I want to look at now, let's look at some of the kind of more nuts and bolts aspect of what you could, in quotes, Protestant, is that the first thing obviously is a vernacular liturgy. And again, we talked about it wasn't a common vernacular liturgy. It was still the language spoken was a language worthy of speaking to God. But right away, you had this sense that the people should be able to appreciate the liturgy as well as the priests. It's the church at prayer. I always say that one of the things I love about Anglicanism is that it isn't the priest going up there and mumbling his words and offering a sacrifice, which you can assist at. It is the church at prayer.
That's right. And of course, it's interesting then to refer to that as a Protestant idea, because of course, St. Paul makes it very clear in 1 Corinthians that the public worship should be edifying. We have the long tradition of the Eastern churches that, much like early Christian Latin and then Caroline English, have tended to use more elevated forms of vernacular tongues. And yes, many of the Eastern churches today have continued using native languages in areas where those are no longer regularly spoken, or you think of something like Old Church Slavonic. But Old Church Slavonic is much more akin to Caroline English versus modern English than Latin would be to modern English. And as someone who loves the Latin liturgy and would certainly argue that we need to preserve a place for it, and keep in mind, Queen Elizabeth I ordered that all the liturgies in the Chapel Royal were to be done in Latin. Okay,
I think
so
it was still continued even in the colleges and such for quite a while.
That's right. I mean, and official editions of the prayer book were issued in Latin. I own one from the late 19th century. So the idea that hiding the text from the people under the cover of a language that, yes, is eminently suited to worship, but nevertheless is not understanded, to use Cranmer's term, to consider that to be a Protestant desire to remove that barrier is very strange to me. And it doesn't seem to make sense of the larger use of language historically in the liturgy.
No, it is. You think about that to be Protestant means to make the liturgy more accessible. That does seem a little non sequitur use of Latin.
Well, it is, and of course, no one in the English Church that I can find ever argued against Latin per se. And in fact, the articles themselves are pretty clear, I think, that whatever it's prayed in needs to be a language that the prayers understand. So, I mean, we know that many clergy did continue saying their office in Latin because they were trained in it. I mean, English clergy were well trained in Latin on the whole up until recent times. So there's no problem with Latin, but the understanding is worship, worship may not be didactic primarily, but it does have a didactic component, and we can't ignore that fact.
And you see this, and that's absolutely the case, because on the Roman side, you have the symmetry of the churches, the stained glass windows, a lot of these things, even some of the statuary and such. The imagery is very important because it teaches, and they've always said that that the images that you see and the symmetry and harmony of the church and the music and everything else has a didactic element, even if it isn't a lingual didactic element. That all of the churches teaches you through beauty, and you see various saints and the symbols that are associated with them help you to understand who they were and to to understand the faith and the saints of the faith.
That's right, and that's why I think it's interesting that both the prayer book and the authorized version of the Bible were intentionally compiled using language that was not the ordinary street English even of that day. I think the English reformers understood well the principle of a sacred tongue. They just felt that Latin had become obscure to the point that though people may have understood conceptually what was happening in the liturgy because of the ceremonial and these sort of ancillary things, that nevertheless so much of the beauty of the liturgy is in the words being conveyed, and it is the church as a whole at prayer. The parishes should not be extensions of the monastic communities. And that was the problem, I think, that we had by the late Middle Ages.
No, definitely. And that was the thing, was that you had, the liturgy was done, both the prayer of the church, the divine office, and then, of course, the Eucharist, the Mass, were both done, and they were really a priestly thing. And they weren't done so that your average person, be they, simple schoolgirl or doctor or working man or whoever it may be, were able to sit there and to get something out of that prayer. The church was praying, and there was a sense of like, trust the church and unite your heart with it. But there wasn't the comprehension wasn't stressed. And I think that I think it's actually a strength of Anglicanism that the prayers are, you read the prayers, be it the daily office and such, which Psalms and the scripture readings, and again the Eucharistic liturgy, really has it is both well articulated as far as the language is concerned. It's also very theologically deep. I think that's just so important, that as you listen to this liturgy week by week, you're going to learn many aspects of how the church prays, and then what the church believes about the sacrifice of Christ and its application.
Yes, and I think there's actually a larger theological issue at play here with this question of language that doesn't get talked about much. We assume that the Roman clergy have all been Latinists. And you and I have both spent many years praying the Roman breviary, the old Roman breviary. And, there are some very obscure things in the Latin Psalms and some of the hymnody that you might understand the words, but it really doesn't make conceptual sense. And as people who have had formal Latin training, you spent time in a community praying the Latin office regularly. What about for the reality that so many of the clergy themselves didn't really know what they were saying? So then what does that say about the nature of the clergy? Are we saying that the clergy are really just sacrament machines?
Well, that's a fascinating point, and it's something I actually would like to go into more in depth at another time, is that one of the aspects of Roman Catholicism and how it differs from Anglicanism most strikingly is that Roman Catholicism is a very devotional church. It's about the go to the Mass, and the Mass, you're praying with your heart more so than your mind. And it's not fair to say that people aren't mentally engaged or intellectually engaged. It's not fair to say. However, as you say, you look into the praying, and I remember being around priests, being in monasteries and reading it myself. You'll sit down to say an office, and you're knocking those psalms out. You're really not taking your time going through them, especially with matins, with your 9 psalms and lessons. And I remember talking to priests, and you're going through there, and they're poring over those psalms to get through them. You're also
18.
As the word, yeah, exactly.
18 in Matins.
And so and I remember my Benedictine prior saying you moved through at a good clip to get through all those Psalms. It's something you're doing out of devotion. You're offering up your prayers to God. Nothing, and I'm not going to criticize that per se. And again, on the laity side, it goes into the Rosary right away. Rosary, it has 15 mysteries. It isn't without its mysteries, but very quickly you're going to pretty much, you end up, it's a prayer of the heart more than a prayer of the mind. And obviously when you get your devotions, your Sacred Heart, your Immaculate Heart, the various saints, you're getting into or even Divine Mercy, which I was reading something recently. It's a time for that right now, and it is all very devotional. It is not a what's the word I'm looking for? It's a prayer of the heart, not as much a prayer of the mind. And I think that's something you're going to have.
Right. This is what to bring this whole thing back around, this idea of the Protestant nature of the church. Father Martin Thornton, he vigorously argues against the idea that the Anglican Via Media has anything to do with Catholic or Protestant. He says the Via Media of Anglicanism is the speculative affective synthesis, that this ability to wed the devotional life to the theological intellectual life, a la Julian of Norwich, that the devotion is entirely predicated upon the theology, and they must never be separated. They must be held together in tandem.
And that's the thing, and you have that with the public liturgies, the Eucharistic liturgy, and then you have morning and evening prayer, and you slow down on the amount of psalmody you do to about, I guess, like 50 verses, and then you have a chapter of the Old Testament, the Gospels, the Epistles, and such, and there is a real sense of reading and thinking much more than getting through the prayers or engaging. You engage your mind, assuming the heart will follow. You don't engage your heart first. And I think with Roman Catholicism, you've seen that with the East also, but with Roman Catholicism, you really have the heart is engaged before the mind oftentimes.
That's right. And we have to have both together in balance. And I think, what's happened, I think, in Rome is that there was an attempt to correct that in the 60s, but of course, they didn't learn from, say, Anglicanism and just totally invented something that has furthered the problems, I think.
Well, Vatican II was an entirely different thing, and that's it was an attempt to dilute the things you have about Roman Catholicism. There's a venerability to it. It's ancient in a sacred language, and there's just a lot of venerable tradition and sense of proximity to God because of the silence, the Latin, all these things are things that were chosen because they were so close to mandatory celibate priesthood. These are things that are all related right back to, and they're seen as things that get you closer to God because they're so close to God. The language that they speak in the language that was on the cross. The silence of the thing that is all of these elements are things that are designed to remind you how close you are to God. Whereas Anglican is about, it isn't a message, your approach to God. It's that God, approaching God is more done through thinking about the theology and the desire to be close to God. You don't have the same immanence that Roman Catholicism likes to present.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. I wanted to take a second here and go through. I'm pulling up the email that I sent you because I'm on my computer. I can't do it. I wanted to look at. So we looked at the question of overall structure and the idea that the structure is a combination of bishop and king, or bishop and prince running the church, and that the Pope is not the default authority which everything must bow to, and the idea that public prayer is it's, if you say it's the speculative
Speculative affective synthesis.
Yes. Using a vernacular liturgy and the theology so that it's more accessible to understand and appreciate the faith and the theology behind the faith. I wanted to touch, not necessarily briefly, but not too deeply, on some of the how the doctrine, as Anglicanism is not doctrinally Protestant, but the way she's expressed some of these doctrines, especially through the 39 Articles, was laid out against the practices of Rome, Wittenberg, and Geneva. I'm not going to bother with Wittenberg and Geneva today because they're both considered Protestant. But looking at the Christians of Rome, so of the articles here, Article 21 on concerning purgatory, which covers purgatory, the invocation of the saints, and something else. I don't have the whole article sitting.
Pardons and relics and indulgences.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And I'll lay this out, and I'll let you go ahead because I've been going on for a little bit here. But I remember the quest. First of all, purgatory is not in the scriptures. It's alluded to, but the idea that if you don't make it to heaven, you can be cleansed for a little while before you get there. Obviously, the term purgatory isn't in the scriptures, and it had also become abused by the Church of Rome at that point in time. It had become, a money-making thing, and people were, and I've actually seen this, the point of talking about, well, I'll just make it up in purgatory. I don't have to try so hard right now. With the relics, obviously, it was going to become it had become a whole commerce. And John Jewell does a whole thing about, people having so many, relics to venerate or so many saints to talk to. They weren't sure who to go for what problem, kind of an idea that had become overwhelmed. So, in your experience and your insights, how do you read this article?
Well, I think we have to realize three things. First, we have to recognize that the articles were never at any point adopted by Convocation of the Church of England as a confessional document. Mm-hmm. They were not. They are a document that is attempting to put in very brief form the Church of England's response to controversies of the day. Mm-hmm. Finally, we also have to have a proper definition of Catholic. And of course, Jewell and many others since him have largely gone to St. Vincent of Lerins for this. And I think he is the best. That which has been believed everywhere, always, and by all. Essentially, what did the undivided church understand? Right. What do the councils that are undisputed proclaim? And so what we have to understand here is that when the issue of purgatory, say, is brought up, the Romish doctrine of purgatory, this is something totally different from the article's point of view than what I would say, argue is the biblical or patristic doctrine of purgatory. Maybe we shouldn't use that term, but you've got a situation by the 16th century where purgatory is a place. It is understood to be essentially on the shores of hell. It is a chamber, a subchamber of hell. Hell itself is an eternal inferno where wanton punishment is meted out just because. And that same punishment, the same fires of hell, are in this place called purgatory to serve as expiation and propitiation for our own sins. That Christ's sacrifice brings us forgiveness and pardon of original sin, but the temporal punishment due to our own individual sins still prevails. And there are one of two ways you can get rid of those. You can either do it through the indulgences, which is itself a bizarre idea that it turns salvation into a mathematical equation. Well, Christ didn't need to be saved. So his merits, which are essentially good works of the law, for all practical purposes. They're infinite. Our Lady, by all measures, I mean, she is preserved by God's grace, and then through an act of her will, she does not sin personally. Fine. So she also has these merits above and beyond what would be necessary for her legal salvation. And then the saints, et cetera, et cetera. So what you have then is this idea that salvation essentially is a matter of the graced works, the works endued with Christ's grace, outweighing the works that aren't. And there's clearly a threshold of these works that are sufficient for salvation. And anything beyond them goes into this treasury that the Pope alone has access to, and he grants through indulgences. Now, if this is your idea of salvation, and I don't think I'm caricaturing it in the popular mind, even today, and I've spent lots of time in traditionalist Roman Catholic churches, this idea that essentially I do enough works and I can get my uncle out of heaven or out of purgatory, completely misrepresents what the scriptures say, 1 Corinthians 3 and elsewhere, and what the patristics understand to be our transformation into the image and likeness of Christ that begins in this life through grace and will continue into the next life through grace until the eschaton. We have purgatory in that sense in our per book liturgy. We pray in the prayer for the whole state of Christ's church that the dead would go forth in continual growth and service in God's love, continual growth. So there is a sense, of course, in patristic Christianity of purifying, of the fire of God is the fuller's soap and the purifying fire. But the Church of England is saying there has been a great abuse of what salvation is, and essentially Christ has been downplayed. And then this spilled over into everything else in practical sort of lay spirituality in the 16th century. Our Lady becomes not an intercessor per se, but a mediator. Only Christ is the mediator. Now, the saints have intercessory ministries, but Our Lady has to mediate for us between ourselves and Christ because he's essentially angry. You know, she's holding back the avenging arm of her son.
I've actually heard that from Roman Catholics that Christ is the great judge, and you approach him with fear and trembling. And we do not dare approach Christ, who is who is the great judge. Therefore, we go through the saints, and they approach for us since they're already there. I've heard that.
Well, I have too. I mean, you can find it in modern Roman Catholic publications with modern imprimaturs on them, and so that's a problem. And what it does then also with the cult of the saints is it got to a point where the saints were understood, at least in the popular mind, to be able to grant favors of their own power. And so, and you'll still see this today, particularly amongst Hispanic Roman Catholics. You know, you will see offerings being made to the saints to gain their favor, as if they have power. And unfortunately, and as someone who grew up evangelical in a very anti-Roman environment, I understand what the Roman Church actually teaches. And I realize the Roman Church today would, on paper, repudiate that idea. But you have a problem still that was much worse in the 16th century of a popular lay mentality that essentially the saints are lesser deities. And it's almost a sort of a quasi-Gnosticism. We have to go through all the various aeons to get up to the supreme deity. And that is not Christianity. That is not patristic Christianity. It's not scriptural Christianity. But we also don't want to go to the other extreme and then say, well, therefore, as the continental churches did, there's no role for the saints. There's no idea of purification after death. There's none of this at all. So the articles are responding to a particular problem of that time.
I think, and you brought it up, and I meant to say that and forgot to as I got in the weeds here, is that the Tertullian Articles is not a theological document.
No.
It is a political document. And it was designed to establish the Church of England, as a church, on the scriptures, the creeds, and the councils, and to separate it from, as distinct from Rome, as distinct from Wittenberg, and as distinct from Geneva. And it actually goes into, and it debunks, or it contradicts some of the teachings of the Lutherans, the teachings of the Calvinists, and again, several teachings of the Romans. So I think you said that very well, and I'm not going to add anything to your talk about purgatory there. I'm going to come back to the idea of saints, but not till the very end. I want to jump now to the sacraments. Specifically the question of the Eucharist, because that's a big one with the Article's condemnation of transubstantiation. And I'll begin just by saying that I think it really comes down to the statement of the Second Lateran Council, 1215, I think, which stated that if anyone states that the bread and wine remain after the consecration, let him be anathema. And interestingly enough, Richard Hooker, fascinating pamphlet I found, Salvation of the Church of Rome, says that Rome doth err, in his language, in asserting the miracle of transubstantiation. That language is very important because if it's a miracle, it's not a sacrament.
That's right. Yeah, I think we've got two problems with transubstantiation. Well, three. The first problem is that the Lateran councils, though Rome would claim they are not ecumenical. Okay, the Orthodox churches had no say in those decrees and never accepted them. So that's your first problem, is you have essentially a local council of the Latin Church. Two, your second problem is if you dogmatize transubstantiation, then what you are saying, I think, is you have to, by extension, dogmatize Aristotelian metaphysics. I don't see how you can assert that these metaphysics exist for this particular thing, but then remain agnostic on the rest of the created order. That's a problem because, of course, patristic thought is largely a Christianized Platonism. So we have to keep that in mind too. And then finally, as you said, the real problem with it is that if you assert that what makes bread bread and what makes wine wine no longer in any shape exists, then you don't have a sacrament. A sacrament is a material means whereby God gives his grace objectively to the world. Okay, we don't assert the annihilation of substances for anything else. A man and a woman in matrimony don't cease being individual man and woman, but they do take on, a tertium quid, something else. Okay, the water in baptism doesn't cease being water; it takes on something else. And this is what a sacrament does. And this is why the church is sacramental. And this is why salvation ultimately is sacramental or incarnational. It must be an extension of the incarnation to be a sacrament. And just as the Athanasian Creed says that our Lord's divinity did not annihilate his humanity, we cannot assert that Holy Communion is properly sacramental if we assert that the bread and the wine are annihilated. It doesn't fit the definition.
And that's interesting that the idea that, and in this we talked about this very briefly, I think the previous podcast, that the sacrament of baptism being different from the sacrament of the Eucharist. Again, the sacrament of baptism does not need a sacred minister absolutely to effect it. It has its action in the action of pouring the water and the action of saying the words, whereas the Eucharist there is a presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He goes on and on in John chapter 6. I am the bread of life. Who eats my flesh, drinks my blood. And the church has always believed that. But the idea being is that ultimately, if someone says how, the answer is it's not given man to know really how Christ is present. And I think John Cossin's comment is the best, and I'm sure it's taken from one of the fathers. I don't remember exactly. He says that Christ is truly, actually, and substantially present by a sacramental and unknown means. He is truly present there, even substantially present there. St. Thomas Aquinas doesn't even say that he says that and again, he's using Aristotelian language, so it's the substance and the accidents. But he even states that the presence is by commission, and does not actually assert that the bread and wine go away. He simply says that the in this understanding of, and again, you could even substitute accidents for attributes. These accidents remain all the natural elements of bread and wine. However, the substance, the what is it, the quiddity of it, it is Christ. Christ has taken over and is truly present. He doesn't need to destroy or render null the natural elements of the bread and wine to be present.
Well, and it actually introduces another problem. And though Origen would not have addressed it per se regards the sacrament, if you say that God destroys the substance of bread and wine, then what you're saying is that God actively is an agent of destruction for that which was created good. Now, nowhere do the patristics ever assert, in fact, to the contrary, they say that that which God has created can never be destroyed because it's good and he is the good. So we wind up with a deep theological problem. I think what we need to do instead is say the Eucharist is simultaneously an icon of Christ's incarnation. It makes that present to us. It is also an icon of our redemption and glorification. We are going to exist in glorified bodies as physical beings. Okay, this is the Christian conviction. Our physical materiality is not destroyed in the eschaton. And so it is odd then to me to claim that, well, but the one thing that actually unites heaven to earth, the Eucharist, would participate in an act of destruction. It's completely contrary to the entire Christian narrative of what salvation is. No, the bread and the wine are being glorified and transcended into something greater through Christ's power.
And going on to there, talking also something about the Eucharist, obviously, is the exhortation of the Mass. And the language in this is a little bit cumbersome. And I think that, again, the 39 articles were designed to be read by people who did not necessarily agree theologically. And both of them say, yes, I can see my position in there. So there is an ambiguity and a vagueness to the text. It's very much on purpose because of its political name. But it states the sacrament, only the cross is, and I don't remember the exact language. The Mass does not offer, the oblation such that it's the cross. And what it comes down to is, and I've been thinking a lot about this, and I almost wouldn't mind doing a podcast on it, is the nature of how the oblation of Christ, the merits of Christ are applied to mankind. And the principal end of the Eucharist is this inner strengthening of man's soul that he might become perfect and bring forward the kingdom of God. The principal act of the Eucharist is not that you say a Mass so that someone else get better or someone else convert to the faith or that someone else, is this kind of vicarious use of the Mass to solve problems or bring about results. In some ways, God would say, rather than praying for your brother to convert to the faith by having a Mass said for him, you go to Mass, you strengthen your soul, and you go talk with him and work on him.
Right. Yeah. And, this is one of those things where I think Trent sort of doubled down, though Rome today is distancing herself from this. But the idea, the article refers to the sacrifices of masses in the plural, that each Mass was a separate propitiatory sacrifice that was not identical to the sacrifice of the cross. It's important to understand that. And so then each sacrifice of each Mass can add more grace to the previous ones. But this all goes back to this late medieval economical approach to what salvation is. Grace is some kind of heavenly currency. It's not the divine energies of God communicated to men.
That's actually a good point. I remember to bring that up, was that there's actually, St. Gregory the Great is the one who was supposed to have initiated this, was the idea of saying more than one Mass for a person's soul after they die.
30 masses.
30 Masses. Which,
Right.
If you stop and think about it, is you say that one Mass isn't enough to save someone's soul. I thought one Mass was the cross of Christ, which saved the whole world. It really approaches heresy. In fact, you could almost say it is. But I mean, this idea of saying more than one Mass for a person's soul, you're right. You reduce the Mass or the Eucharist to a form of currency to buy something, and the idea that you would need more than one, I think, is a huge misunderstanding of the nature of the Eucharist, of reenacting or active remembering of Christ's sacrifice.
That's right. I mean, the Mass brings Calvary to our altars. It is one and the same. This is why we understand that Christ's sacrifice, his one sacrifice, began at the Last Supper. That's where it started, and it doesn't complete until it is finished. So there are intercessory components, of course. We could, to use evangelical language, plead the blood. Okay, well, we're not saying there's a whole separate way of sacrificing or a whole other category of sacrificing. We're saying there is one that was full, perfect, and sufficient. And we can participate in it sacramentally in the Mass, and then we can offer up our intercessions together with that, of course. Because ultimately, our intercessory ministry is entirely a participation in Christ. He ever liveth to make intercession for us. So you cannot separate these things from the cross. That is the only sacrifice with any, to use the 16th century language, with any merit. Everything else is contingent upon it.
You could almost say that, the sacrifice of the cross was not an action in time for to be applied externally. It was an eternal act which happened in time to be applied internally.
Well, that's what St. John sees, the Lamb having been slain from the foundation of the world. It's an eternal sacrifice. And we participate in that. We enter into that reality at the altar.
So I want to, any final thoughts on that there?
No.
I wanted to touch very briefly on, kind of as a closing, on some of the aspects that I'm going to call them problematic aspects of the Protestant effects of England. And I'm going to start with the idea that whereas the invocation of the saints was certainly abused, and aspects of how this was done, they were removed from the Anglican liturgy. So we are the only apostolic church between Rome, Constantinople, and Canterbury, which, I mean, obviously the Anglo-Catholic and such, and I think there actually may have been a continuation of some devotion to the saints that was done by, say, your higher churchmen like the William Lauds of the world and such. But the public prayer of the church, the Eucharist, the Book of Common Prayer, or the daily office, does not commemorate saints.
With one exception, the Benedicite. We directly address other beings, the angels, the saints, all these, which of course is scriptural, and that's even more interesting. But you're right. Other than that, the 1549 did have the veneration of Our Lady and the saints in the canon. So this is now where we get into the bigger issue. And why our church, for example, does not have the 39 Articles as in the canons as an authoritative document, because though it may have been seen as necessary, given the great abuses in that time, to just strip all these things away, we are in a very different situation now. And so Anglo-Catholics have been right to say, look, if our having removed the role of the saints from the public liturgy then gives the false impression that the saints have no role in the Christian life or in the liturgical life, that's an error, and that's not Catholic. So we must restore them, which of course we have done with the missals and the Anglican breviary and these sorts of things. So we have to understand that maybe when we you have that continental phrase "semper reformanda." I think there is a way one can interpret that in a Catholic sense in the Church of England, that we must always be making sure
that's a good way of putting it.
With
it was reformanda, that they were taken out when there was an abuse. It's time for them to be put back in.
Right. It's now time to educate.
They may have overdone it.
That's right.
That's right. The second thing I'm going to say is that one of the aspects of the Church of England, I think you could be argued is one of the effects of Protestantism, is that really the Church has been at war with itself almost since it began. You've had the Puritans against the Anglo-Catholics, which continued all of the Civil War. Then you had the arrival of the evangelicals and the nonconformists and the dissenters. Part of that is because of the political nature of it, is that England was a Puritan or Protestant country, and so, for example, with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which I believe was about 1660-ish, when Louis XIV cast out all this kind of Protestant contingent that had almost its own sub-state, but most of them came to England. And many of them assimilated into the Church of England, but they brought with them questionable theology, vague theology, or even errors, and they began to sneak into the Church of England, kind of like a Calvinist bent to it, so much so that, again, Edward Pusey gave a sermon in the early 1800s on the Eucharist in one of the major colleges, and they were so offended they banned it for 2 years. So this idea that I think that you don't see that in Rome nearly as much, because Roma locuta est, Roma has spoken. That's the end of the argument. Mm-hmm. And the Archbishop of Canterbury doesn't really have that ability the same way the Pope does. And so you have this mini civil war that's gone on in the Church of England throughout most of her history.
Right. And of course, you really see this come to a head with William and Mary and the following years after that, this idea that societal conformity brought about partially through the state church is more important than doctrine. And of course, this is what both the Oxford Fathers and the evangelical revivalists are trying to counter. Nowadays, we're in a very different situation in the Church of England, where respectability politics have taken over any desire whatsoever to have orthodox doctrine. And so now, what do we have? A church that I'm not even sure you can really properly call a church anymore in any meaningful term. So this was the issue, is when we allowed the society to use the church as a tool for cohesion without much regard to the actual doctrine, you create a problem. And that was latitudinarianism, and that's really what I think has led to a lot of the modern disputes we've had.
Really, it's a shame that you didn't have a more clear, of the Puritan, like high church, low church, and as long as they agreed on some baseline principles, although they may have tried that, they just simply couldn't get there. But to say, okay, you're part of the branch, but that's going to be lower church, and you're not going to use, some of the bells and smells and bells, as they like to say, but we're going to agree on this baseline of doctrine. We're over here. We're going to do that, and you're going to leave us alone and just not come, and we'll leave you alone. And I think it's kind of an aspect of human political existence, because we have it in this country where one side can't leave the other one alone.
Right. And we still have this problem in many of our own parishes, unfortunately, maybe not as pronounced, but it's not just a matter of one ceremonial taste, but you cannot have a Catholic, patristic, and a Calvinist perspective on salvation held together. They are contradictory of each other. You can't have a church that gives any kind of idea that both are equally tolerated as doctrinal convictions. They can't be. So, our task is to say, well, how then do we welcome people who may come from different theological backgrounds and gently instruct them into the Catholic faith in such a way that, it's not a matter of just edict or pronouncement, but it really is true, an authentic conversion.
Mm-hmm. True evangelism, as opposed to, that's the thing, is when people go to the Church of Rome, I don't know about Orthodox as well, but you come in there and you're almost confronted with this is what you have to do. If you leave, and they'll say, fine, you leave, you're off to hell, no salvation outside of, the Church of Rome, but this is what you have to do. And people, they finally decide, okay, they're going to do it. Where I think the Anglican approach is a little bit, come on in and start learning about the faith, start practicing the faith, and we'll work on what you're, obviously, if there's someone's committing serious sin, you're going to say, okay, we need to, have a conversation here. But I think that a lot of times people will come in and we will leave them where they are, insofar as they're kind of where they are with Christianity, while we teach them and get them closer to God through both the beauty of the liturgy and through instruction, rather than requiring them to leave everything behind when they cross the threshold into a church the way the Church of Rome would do.
Right.
Other thing and I don't know, this is something that I see as being one of the effects of Protestantism, although I don't know that it's necessarily falls in the back of the Church of England per se, because I think it's something that the effects are felt in France and they're felt elsewhere, was that the Protestant, especially the Calvinist perspective, and people come to me sometimes and wonder how anybody could believe in Calvinism, this double predestination, and how do you believe someone is born already damned to hell, and doesn't that go against the teachings of the Gospels? And I always like to answer that I think that what Calvinism did was it kept the streets clean. Is that if you talk to somebody and they drink too much, or they're a whoremonger, or they're living an immoral life, or they're violent, you say to them, you clearly aren't, you're not predestined. I can't hang around you. I have a reason to exclude you from society. I have a reason to in the English sense, send you off to Australia or something, get rid of the criminal element, because they're not, it's an excuse to be able to do that. You could say, they are not predestined to heaven, therefore me keeping society with them is dangerous. St. Paul does mention not leaving, do not have fellowship with known sinners. But that's a dangerous thing, because if this sinner is willing to convert his ways, you need to have patience with him and work with him. It's only the hardened or the people who will not. But you have that. And if that creates a society by the end of the 70s, early 1800s, you have it in Dickens's novels are full of it, of, Ebenezer Scrooge, the hardened old sinner, or Mr. Tookhamchild, who's this horrible schoolmaster. They actually bring that up in the Pink Floyd, The Wall, the certain teachers, whatever. Because you had this in Benjamin Disraeli and the Sibyl and the Two Nations, how you really had this divide where England wasn't a Christian society in many respects due to this hardening. And I think it really has to do with the effects of Protestantism. I don't know that you see that in France, or especially in the southern nations.
Yes, Calvinism is a satanic doctrine that creates a parody of the kingdom of God. There's an idea that we can build the kingdom on earth as a civil society, and the way we do that is essentially through legalism. It is not the Orthodox doctrine that the kingdom of God is an already not yet reality that transcends this world, and that we enter into our baptisms by our transformation into becoming, to be deified as Christ. It is an attempt to impose a moral, civil, and ethical law on everyone, and force a Christian society. And it does it under the auspices of the worst possible threat that God has already determined that most of you are going to spend eternity in an inferno, and at his great delight and pleasure, because he's sovereign. And if he's sovereign, then so is the state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It just builds. It is a political doctrine that is satanic.
It's kind of funny, because I don't think it was something that the Church of England wanted to have happen. And I think you could find evidence of protestations and dissatisfactions with this happening. But the fact that, and to kind of sum up here, that England ended up with the name Protestant. I don't know whether Rome slapped it on to England and then England said, yeah, sure, okay, fine. Or whether it was a movement of Protestants who were seeking to reform, and they said, yes, we're going to join that. But what I think began as a desire to clean up the church and to reform it, to protest against the dominant church at that time, toward the end, and by the 1800s, turned into a trend, a social trend that I think that in many ways was detrimental. And I'll finish my part by saying that it's interesting. We are both part of the Anglican Catholic Church, and the word Protestant shows up nowhere in any of our documents or any of our church at all.
No, and of course the unfortunate reality is that whatever the Caroline Divines and Elizabethan reformers and all of that had in mind, today the Church of England is completely and thoroughly non-Catholic by any reasonable definition of that term. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're Protestant. I don't know what Protestant is. One of those words that I think has very little actual meaning practically, but it is highly individualistic. It seems to care much more about issues of social respectability than it does doctrine. And we have to continue the Catholic faith of England now outside of the auspices of that organization.
This is an age of when I was in the Carthusians, there was a man by the name of he was Brother Michael of the Holy Trinity, and he wrote a 3-volume set on Fatima and the meaning of Fatima. He was I think it was Father Francois Marie or something like that in the Carthusians. But one of the conclusions he came to in this thing on Fatima was that the end of the 20th century Vatican II would be the great apostasy spoken of by, I think it was St. Paul at the end times. And I think there's some real evidence that might be the case, and every church is affected by it.
Everyone.
And that's has collapsed, and you've got, from John Paul II and his praying, inviting pagans in to pray for peace, to, Pope Francis and giving blessing to same-sex couples, and the Church of England is the same. I mean, the Church of England has begun ordaining women. Yesterday was the 30-year anniversary of the ordination of women, which is clear. It isn't just not mentioned in the Bible; it's condemned in the Bible. They're clearly violating the Bible for the sake of progressive politics and for the sake of conformity with the spirit of this world. And then you also have the syncretism and the unwillingness to speak the truth that is ordination of openly gay ministers, doing gay marriages, on and on and on. You really, at this point in time, you look at it and you're like, the distance between orthodoxy and modern religion has become such a gulf that you wonder, where you even begin.
Well, and yes, and that's why it's so important to recognize that no matter how we want to define these terms, in the 16th century context, the word Protestant is exactly what the modern day Roman Church is compared to the Roman Church then. It is a different communion with a different theological understanding, and that should sober all of us, that in some sense these debates are meaningless today, because we are not dealing with a Pope St. Pius V and a Roman Curia that has any sense of itself. We're dealing with a social justice warrior who cares more about the climate than he does about mentioning our Lord's name to groups of atheists and abortionists. So what does that have to say? What really is Protestant then? And where is Catholicism?
In this case, you're right. Being a Protestant today would almost mean being more Orthodox, since considering how far away. And you could say, "Are you a Protestant today?" You say, "I'm a Protestant. I protest to what's going on." And it would actually make you Orthodox as opposed to patently heretical.
Or maybe we can use the Latin definition: "I testify for the truth."
There you go.
I
Very good. Any final thoughts, Father Deacon?
don't think so.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you all for listening.